Good afternoon and welcome to our penultimate public event of the 2024 Bach Institute. This afternoon we're going to be hearing from our principal guest conductor, John Harbison, about the cantata that was rehearsed this morning and will be performed or presented as part of the church service tomorrow. This is Cantata BWV 79, Gott der Herr ist Sonn und Schild. And just to remind you that since this is the penultimate, the ultimate, the final public event is, of course, the showcase concert featuring our spectacular 2024 Bach Institute Fellows, Sunday evening, 7 p.m. in the sanctuary. And welcome to John.
Thank you. Assuming that everyone heard the rehearsal, is that a fair assumption among our guests? I'm going to talk really about two cantatas today and try to think about Bach's working method and the relationship of that to his faith and to his region. There are two cantatas for Reformation Sunday. This cantata and cantata number 80, Ein fester Burg. And they are, the reason there are only two is about calendar issues. Someone can explain that to you, and I'm not the one to do it. But it is really, Bach took the opportunity whenever it came up. That is to say, these were the two that were available to him in his composing period. And clearly very important to him because not only his origin in the Leipzig region, which is the height of, really the heart of conservative Protestant orthodoxy, Lutheranism. Very, very important to him to mark the holiday the few times it came up, that he was fortunate enough to meet it on the calendar with two really very demanding pieces. I'm sorry we don't have we probably should be performing both of them on Reformation Sunday to get a sense of really how unusual and how different they are from other Bach cantatas. Both of them are concerned with something which the 20th century deals with in a rather different way through amplification. Both of them are intent on making probably the biggest noise that really any Bach cantata makes. And of course the present one, the one we're performing, does it with much smaller forces than Cantata 80. But nevertheless, the experience of the piece is of a kind of assault. And actually, it really needs to be a relentless, shall we say, so imposing a sheer physical sound that we realize what an important day we're celebrating. Reformation Sunday, and the few times that it came into Bach's working calendar, was a day he was not going to miss in terms of impressing the listener with a really powerful burst of energy. So our main task as performers is to have the right energy to startle the congregation with how much sheer intensity these pieces can produce. In this case, this piece, Gott der Herr ist Sonn und Schild. It's important to think a little bit about the text, which both cantatas have similar texts, actually. The image of the protection of their faith, both its rightness, Sonn, and its militancy, the Schild. The idea that these are militant pieces, and that Bach's region felt about the rest of Germany that we're ready to bring it on. Saxony, the whole region, Bach's entire itinerary, when you chart it, he goes to many places, he visits lots of places, he travels a lot. It's all within a radius, really, in any direction of about 80 miles. He is very, very active in moving around his province, so are his sons, but it is precisely, some widened circumference around Leipzig. That is his entire itinerary. In fact, we read a lot about him traveling to this town and that town, and then look on the map. There's actually a book about this by our friend at Brandeis, the Bach scholar. But it's following those travels, Bach traveling frequently to other sites and visiting other parishes, and then you look on the map, he's gone 20 miles. The interest, this kind of interest in this kind of repertoire and in the way that Bach is approaching it is very centered in one part of the world. And it happens, of course, to be the same part of the world where the founder originated and did many of his most important things. The Luther footprint is heavy there. It's also, it also is visitable in some other regions, but particularly in that area. So from the first sound of this piece, and actually the first sound of Cantata 80, you realize that a rather atypical pact is being made with the audience, that these are pieces that are meant to impress. We can wrestle you to the ground, is really the idea. And when you read about the little bit of correspondence that is extant from the era that Bach was making these pieces, the two Renaissance, the two celebrations of the Renaissance were obviously important occasions. The first of the pieces, Cantata 80, he begins working on almost as soon as he starts writing cantatas. The first version of that opening chorus goes back to it's really coincidental with his first cantata compositions. And he revises and reworks that piece and continues to shape it and enlarge it. It winds up very big. It's twice the length of our cantata. But its main footprint remains very similar. That is to say, it's going to be a celebration that will simply almost sonically just overwhelm the congregation with the importance of the occasion. To envision why this stance is taken, we have to sort of try to reconstruct how regional Germany was at the time. Our country is very regional. I think you could say you could get people's dander up about certain kinds of issues by things about the South, maybe West Coast. When I lived in the West Coast, that was more of a laid-back thing, but it was definitely assertion of difference. But we can't really quite conceive how, though they were citizens of the same country, how little citizens of the neighboring provinces felt that they were on the same wavelength with Bach's province, which was, fortunately, I guess for him, in a direct line to the founder. And of course, the founder is the only founder of a religious faith who is also a poet and composer. So that Bach's material is actually the core of his composing material stems from his thought on material left to him by the founder of his religious division. So he's the leader of the Lutherans of that area, not only in matters of faith and doctrine, but in aesthetics, in poetry, in poetic expression, in hymnology. The whole structure of the hymn, the hymn as its role in the service, comes directly down in Bach's region from the founder. And the importance of the chorale, I can't remember, there's a certain categorization for certain chorales, most of them written by Luther tunes, which have in the Lutheran faith a special sanctification. What are they? When you look at the organ chorale preludes, they're often grouped together. And they signify a teaching which the Lutherans were very unanimous in, not only in paying great attention to it, but in really being responsible, every member of the congregation, for the meaning of the text and the importance of the text to the community. So we have Gott der Herr ist Sohn und Schild is a summary of what this sort of regional concept of Lutheranism would be. Son is enlightenment and revealing of the presence. Shield is that sort of element of fight, which we find in these cantatas, that we are asserting to the point of belligerence the force of our religious conviction. And that is in this text somewhat to a lesser extent than in Cantata 80, where it is, I'd have to say the text could be described much of the time as pugnacious. It's as if we are picking a fight, you better answer in some form. But this cantata certainly presents itself as a strong force of wind. And I think the proper performance of it is the one that doesn't ever allow what I would call the normal element of contrast. It's very unusual to be responsible for pieces of music in performance where contrast is not asked for. But if the more you study the first chorus of this piece, if you're thinking, well, my job as a performer is to say, okay, here's the new section, here's another section. There aren't any new sections. Really, everything is the same statement, reaffirmated, restated, repowered. And so that by the end of the piece, you are where you were at the beginning, but hopefully even a little further down the line. It's an unusual way to, I can't think of another cantata that says, okay, you don't have any responsibility for doing something different here. What you have to do is come out and just launch. Which is, and then of course one of the greatest effects in any, for the listener, in any attendance at a Bach cantata is what happens at the end of these choruses. Because what he almost always does after the biggest of his choruses is minimum force. So that the voice with which you're spoken is a completely different intimacy. It's almost like the two worlds are not conjunct, they simply happen next to each other. So that the oboe, when the oboe starts that second piece, you couldn't come into an atmosphere more unlike where you've been. And this effect in the Bach cantata, I can't think of anything quite like it in a piece in movements, where his, I would say, positive delight in following the most excited badinage is the fewest people. Bringing the whole concentration, the whole message of the piece completely into such a different level. I think as a listener, it's always it's quite an adjustment. You really have to give yourself in to this amazing gesture. Then of course he comes back. And he comes back very literally to the very same material from the first chorus. It's an unusual thing for him to do. It's as if to say, this dialectic is not ever going to leave this piece. And particularly in the presence of the timpani and the horns, it doesn't. And by the end of the piece, we realize, oh yes, we understand. The message is this and this meditation. And nothing really, no middle ground, no transitional world. The world of thought and meditation, and the world of the incredibly imposing presence of powers much greater than we. Sohn und Schild. And the shield is really important too, because you don't want to underestimate how embattled Bach and his colleagues in that corner of Germany felt, basically based on matters of faith. Recent wars, incredible amount of animus, that they were asserting not only their particular belief structure, but also their regional integrity. So we're not fearing attack in the same way, but I think that the militancy of the first piece is something where everybody has to just let go. And I have always loved the loud pieces of Bach, partly because they don't care about contrast. Part of the aesthetic of Bach's period is to sort of make stretches of music which really say only one thing. And I think part of the difficulty for performers is because we're all used to articulating and subphrasing and answering and breaking it down, and that's not what's asked for us in this music. And even in the arias, I think we usually are committed to taking the audience, the listener, taking each other to a place and staying there, which I think is part of the fascination of performing this music. It asks something that we don't usually want to do. It would be really probably the wrong track to be looking at the second piece in this cantata and thinking, well, where's the change? What's different? I think that's the wrong question. I think our main thing we're trying to do there is take our listeners somewhere and have them with us exactly there when the piece ends. And then, of course, rather strikingly, it then goes back to the beginning of the cantata in terms of sonority. So it's a very responsive to its day thing. And of course, Reformation Sunday, I don't quite understand the way the calendars work, but Bach seems to have only had 2 opportunities for it. One he had sort of anticipated because he started Cantata A at the beginning of his cantata composition cycle. He was interested in making a chorale prelude on Ein feste Burg, and he's with that piece for many, many years, and that becomes the other piece for Reformation Sunday, and there are no more. That's the only time it came in the calendar. And if we were to get back in the mood of that Sunday, I think we'd be pretty hopped up. We'd be feeling like this is not, it's almost much more like, it's more like a football culture than anything I can think of. That is to say, regionally, hear this. And I think that's what we're given in these 2 cantatas. Because those of us, I haven't performed 80 very recently, but that's in a very different scale, and it's a similar thing. The chorus hits you and hits you harder. And it's fun to perform if you've been waiting to be able to do something like that. These pieces are written all generally on 2. I've always said I've always wanted to compare it to I knew some people when I lived in LA who were writing for soap operas, and they were 2 weeks ahead, and they would go lock themselves into a motel and they would bat out the 2 week ahead thing. Bach's cantatas turned out to be 2 weeks ahead, pretty much, and there's actually a whole book of the sketches which take you through that. And his cycle was he needed to leave time for the copying of the parts and whatever other practical things, maybe the teaching of an instrument. But that seems to be the way that he planned his life. And once he got to Leipzig, where he was really on, except for Lent, and of course in Lent he did things like write Matthew Passion and that kind of thing. But except for Lent, the 2-week cycle was the way his clock was working. And so this piece was probably fitted into that, even though the first sketches might have been earlier. We know from looking at his sketchbook that as he's fair copying a piece, he's writing out the thing the copyists are going to make for the people to go perform for him. 2-week ahead sketches are down in the lower staves. So he's on his clock, and it's a pretty demanding clock. It's amazing that he was able to sustain it really for best part of 3 years. Our cantata is in the 3rd year cycle, and I would say that's no way to characterize the cycles being very different from each other. Very, very strong pieces turn up in all 3. Why does he stop? I think he really feels that he has finally covered almost any day that could come up on the calendar. Because then the cantatas become very, very spare in number, very choice, because the latter cantatas are an incredibly wonderful group. He no longer is perhaps as efficient and quick to the task, but there's something about those pieces that are their volunteerism that are quite different. And he then is just filling holes. The calendar's a little different. It comes to Sunday, he doesn't really have the right text. He'll write a new piece. And that group of cantatas is really, I think, often of quite different character than the ones that are done in the 2-week cycle. So, as for what's hard about performing Bach cantatas, I really think, for me, the hardest thing about the aesthetic is that we're not asked to inflect very much within a cycle of a single movement. And I think as performers, we're taught to make things interesting. That's not really what we need to do in a Bach cantata. We're meant to seize the message of the movement and sustain it and believe it. And of course, we're meant to read the text, which will help us to do exactly that. But I think if you're say, playing in a string quartet, you're thinking much more of a fresh start, movement by movement, and of trying to think locally about what's going to be interesting here. I think the local is much less important than the establishment of the overall character. At least in conducting the music, I've always felt that's really the conductor's job, is to stay loyal to the character of the movement. So, those of you who are at the Institute, have you had Bach cantata experience before? Yes. What did you take away from it? What was different about it?
Feel free to stand up and answer at length, and then I'll just repeat what you say so that our people watching on the live stream. So, go ahead.
So I guess I had one experience before this where I performed an aria from BWV 187 in a church service, but it was a standalone aria. So I think having the context of the full cantata is a much more comprehensive experience, and really lets the music speak more because of the ways juxtaposed with the different movements.
So that was a comment, and maybe I'll just pass this around. It might be easier. Just saying that the experience of playing an aria excerpted from a cantata was a very different experience than playing a full piece.
Well, and of course, the oboe literature for the oboe, the Bach cantata is probably the central locus. Why was it the oboe?
Here.
I'm not entirely sure. I think maybe because of convenience, it could have been a thing, but I also have a theory that Bach is interested in, well, first of all, like classical Greek rhetoric, but I think he certainly knew about classical drama as well, and oboe was often, the oboe's ancestor, the aulos, was often the instrument of lament in ancient Greek times, and to even see in things like the St. Matthew Passion, it seems like the oboes are lamenting, and some of these cantatas aren't necessarily in a lament sense, but I think it was convenience, and then there might be an element of that.
One curious thing about it, about the English horn, is this is some of the very first appearances of English horn are in Bach cantatas, and there seems to have been some. Who was playing? Who would have been playing what you're playing?
Sorry, I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, who were the players? There were a few professional players.
Right. I guess then I'm not entirely sure who would have been.
The heavy brass were town employees. The trumpeters were. Sometimes a single violinist and a single oboist, but not continuously. But in general, the students in the school, in the choir school, were instrumentalists, and particularly teaching each other unusual instruments. Like, I'm sure English horn had to be taught. Bach cantatas are really the first very, very vigorous appearance of the English horn. But it also was really, it was the pedagogy, it was a school where everyone was essentially drafted into the performing force. And you will, if you read the Bach handbook and Bach's remarks about this, a lot of complaints about the behavior of the students. And he had, part of his job was disciplinary and so forth, and I think that wore him down. But Bach should have remembered, I guess, because most of the tales about him as a young man was he was in a lot of trouble. he was constantly being disciplined. Yeah.
So playing oboe.
Brother that played the oboe. Not that would.
Was he in this ensemble?
No, he went to Sweden.
Oh, okay.
So that was Bach also had a brother who played the oboe who ended up in Sweden. Yeah.
In any case, the oboe became for Bach a very personal voice. I have to say the choice of the oboe is extremely deeply meant, usually, and very, very, very carefully chosen. He was himself obviously not a wind player. He was a good violinist. He played viola, played a little cello, but not concert level. But it is interesting to know that his main participation seems to be not as conductor, but more often in the viola section.
So not playing the keyboard.
Usually student keyboard. And most of the figures seem to, and particularly the ones that are quite often wrong, are students trying to figure out by ear in the rehearsal what the chords are. And the editors of the Bach Gesellschaft have gone through those and tried to make some improvements, but occasionally you see some figures think, what the heck? And it's really because somebody was back there in rehearsal thinking, I think that chord was the so-and-so. And rehearsal time was not lavish, for sure. A lot of, in the general scheme of things, they had to do the two-performance thing for most of the Leipzig time. And one was up the street. It was if you go to Leipzig, you see that they pushed, particularly a big ensemble which needed a lot of equipment. It was about a 2-block uphill, slightly uphill move, which probably everybody had to be participating in to do the second performance, a whole set of second performances up in the other church. So it was all hands on deck for sure. It was also a good deal of the production would have to be, the copying was done in-house. Some of the choruses were obviously placed in that role from time to time. And then the teaching of instruments was also within, to a great degree. the experienced oboe, if there was another oboe needed, you know, that would be their task. The staff was, in fact, the lack of staff and the unwillingness of kids that age was really the reason that Bach finally wandered away from the job. Really it was mostly the discipline. It's interesting, ironic it was discipline because a lot of the stories about early Bach was he was a major discipline problem. He was constantly in trouble with the authorities and so forth. But I think it wore him down as the production line got harder and harder. And his own production goes really covering almost every week for a couple of years, filling holes. Actually, for the whole time he's on the job, there's a few Sundays which will come up, which for some reason he didn't yet have a cantata. He'd go back to work. But it really was the most amazing feat of, let's just say, it's the closest thing to it is what some of the people I knew when I lived in LA do in the film studios or TV. Very, very, here's the date. It's got to be done. We'll need it for the rehearsal.
Do we have any other questions from fellows or from our guest audience here?
As a young person, I didn't know much about Bach, but when I found him, I was just astounded, and I got a copy of the 371 chorales, and I'm not a piano player, but I played through that. I'd like to ask you if you could make any comments about the chorale harmonizations in either these cantatas or any others that particularly strike you. I found them incredible.
They are incredible, but the reason they're incredible, the biggest reason, is that he's setting words. And the unusual chords that are so admired and the very unusual voice leading and so forth are all because the text of the chorale gives him an opportunity to think into some progression that he's never tried before. So I think it is very valuable for people to study the chorales, but not without the words. Because you don't know why he comes up with this goofy chord. I mean, sometimes really unusual, sometimes really not very analyzable. But it really is always that he's meeting a situation where and he also really wants to take advantage of the final chorale as a summary for the basic ideas of the whole piece. So he really wants the attention of the chorale of the congregation to be locked in to the last chord of the piece. That's one of the reasons there's so much, really a lot of work in those pieces. I mean, he's not just, if you have a volume of all the chorale harmonizations, you think this guy is just almost like a show-off. He can't ever do it the same way. Well, of course it's not the same way because it's a new set of words. And each time that set of words takes him down some other path. And he seems to be completely unfazed by meeting using a chord that he probably wouldn't have any idea how to describe. Because it's all voice leading anyway. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Speaking of the chorales, I have a question about the final chorale in this cantata. Of course, the horns come back and they're featured, but given that the profile of the piece is we're loud, right? And we just want to be. I was surprised that the voicing was so low. I wondered what you thought about that.
The voicing of the last chorale is entirely based on the fact that he's going to use the horns. So he has to squash the chorale. And because he's got this through thing with the horn motive. And the through composed thing is so important to the cantata. Yeah, so the voices are at a disadvantage because he's going to stay in G major. But I think in general, the harmonization of the chorales are taught in schools as curiosities. You know, this boy, he came up with look at this wild chord. The chords are always the result of him finding something in the text that forces him into hearing something different. And it's very unlikely that he thought in terms of the uniqueness of the chord, except in the situation, because he's not thinking analytically as he's composing. I mean, you can tell he's the ultimate of thinking this way, you know, this part, this part. So if a chord is, some people love, my teacher when I was growing up, was first studying piano with a very, very good teacher, and she had me harmonizing chorales. She would show me the chorales, but without the text. And I look at some of those chords and think, what's that? Where's that coming from? And of course, it's very clear when they're in context. And sometimes you think you've seen him really off limits, but you've never seen it all until you've seen it all. It's one of the fun things about singing in a Bach choir is that it's not over till it's over. The end of the piece is going to usually have some sounds that you've never really seen, never heard before.
Any other questions, comments? There are a whole bunch of people in the back there. Does anyone have any questions for John? I wanted to make an observation that I was noticing today in the cantata, which is that, you know, you think about chorale cantatas, and obviously this one is not. 80 is. But the return of the same motive in the third movement, suddenly accompanying a chorale, a very familiar chorale, made me think that I wonder if some way that chorale is underlying the first movement as well.
It's very likely. It's always seemed to me he knew what chorale was going to. And in fact, I think the choice of the outline of the piece for a composer like Bach is not going to be piece by piece. He's probably always looking ahead. This will be there, this will be there. And I'm sure that chorale was embedded in his plan for the piece. And of course it influences the key of the piece. And the fact that the horns are going to be involved. It's a tough key for the horns, but it's great for what he's trying to do, which is create that feeling of almost uncomfortable excitement. It'd be nice if we find another way to do this piece than just go all out all the way, but there really isn't. There are a few like that, yeah.
Here, let me.
I'm a non-musician, so I'm going to ask a speculative question. I apologize for that. We've been listening to a lot of the 3 keyboard pieces that Bach composed at the end of the Weimar period before he went to Leipzig. And, you know, it strikes me that what's different about these pieces is it's just like the exuberance of the human voice in them compared to those other really cool but intricate pieces that were sort of meant for education, whereas these are meant for practical church services, that sort of thing. Can you just speculate on how Bach might have changed during that time between like 1722 and 1725, like in his conception of himself as an artist?
Well, that's a really good question. Bach is a very unusual case of a composer who at a very early time staked out a whole bunch of areas that he was going to explore very deeply. And that is why almost all of his music is in cycles, in silos. And he didn't work on, he would work on one for a while and come back. Christoph Wolff's newest book on Bach is entirely on this subject, on the cycles, on the plan for the career, and Bach's adherence to constantly returning to where there's still an unfinished piece of the cycle. And the cycles involve the collections of keyboard music, which were all planned really kind of simultaneously, but finally each one carried through on its own. Can't remember, the first one is a funny choice. What is the first cycle? It's what my harpsichord teacher had me playing in Berlin. It's not partita. Partita, I think, was the second keyboard cycle.
Not suites.
No. In any case, he did seem to, there was a missing link at the end, which really turned out to be the last movements of the B minor Mass, which is why the last pieces he wrote are in that piece. That it's the filling in of the hole in that piece is the last music that he wrote. The rest of that music precedes that I'd always call it a last minute save of completing all the cycles that are within that piece, because he had most of the rest of that piece together for quite a while. But it is, in terms of its actual finding all its parts together, it's really one of the last, it's about the last thing he worries about. And Et Incarnatus is probably the last thing he thought of, which is one of the most forward-looking pieces, imitation not dependent on interval, which, out of which probably a huge stream of 20th century thinking evolves. Very unusual that every part that comes in seeming invitation sings a different motive. And that's a last thought worthy of a last thought. But clearly he's and Christoph's book is wonderfully clarifying in this, that all his career is the mapping out of these big cycles. Some of them are keyboard, some of them are vocals, and filling them in as opportunity arises. And he goes back to them every time he gets a chance to make a decision to return. And the last thing he has, appropriately enough, is 2 chunks of B minor Mass.
I'll go ahead and ask a speculative question. If Bach was willing to use new instruments such as the English horn and I believe others, as a speculation, if he had had access to modern instruments, could one speculate as to whether he would have actually used them or preferred them?
Yeah, we do have evidence that Bach was not at all conservative about new instruments. And the instruments must have been really hard to control for the first players. And it's interesting that we have really early use of instruments in Bach, but mostly in the hands of his docents. The biggest fight of his career was when they wouldn't let him hire his own, what I call from an MIT perspective, the section people, who were his teaching sort of arms. And when he was not allowed to make the decision of those hires, was the break. And that's what those letters are about. And Bach is, I think, very understandably angry because that they're the people who are doing the week-to-week teaching, both chorally and instrumentally, particularly with things like unfamiliar instruments. And if he can't hire those people, basically his whole operation is a mess. And that's the point at which he sort of backs away. There's still quite a few years left, but his active the creation of new music for the job and coaching of it really diminishes. And he seems to basically just kind of cruising to the final. He gets interested in trying to fill in some of the cycles, writing. It's not clear what he's thinking about performances of them, but that is where he goes. And he kind of gives up on trying to teach the week's cantata to the choir. And the bad temper or the contentiousness that you read about, that you hear in those letters, you see it, you hear it, that wasn't new. He was the very first written correspondence of Bach has a lot of that. He has a feisty temperament, and he tends to be argumentative. And so the business of the sort of fighting spirit that you read in the last letters is just not a sudden thing. He is certainly upset that he's not making his own hires anymore. And I must say, reading them and having been in a university for a while, It's unbelievably familiar. It hasn't, that sort of dispute has not left. It's people want, if you're doing some larger enterprise, you want to be able to decide who's going to be communicating it down the road, and that's where his temper came out. And there's a book, I can't remember which of the recent Bach biographers, one of the touchstones is how much he enjoyed argument.
Any other questions, thoughts, observations?
He taught for a while in Weimar, by the way. He had a bunch of his students, most of them were his sons, but he had them all just put their night's work or a couple of days' work out on the table, and he'd walk past and kind of do a walk-through commentary. I wrote assembly line composition teaching. It's really, it's wonderful. I hope it's probably a bit embroidered story, but it's a fantastic thing to think of, that he really all he wanted to know was what was the recent thing and what was the most useful thing to say. And I had a teacher like that, a composition teacher like that in Berlin, Boris Blocher. He says, I teach 5 minutes a week. And when you come into my office, be ready to point to what's new. And so we all went out, all the composers, he had about 6 or 7 composers he was teaching, we all sat there, the secretary would come out, move us in, we'd point, he would look at the place, he'd make his remark, and we'd be out. And so it's kind of interesting to think that was something about when Bach was assembly line teaching with students, that was kind of sort of what he was doing. That's the thing you should be thinking about this week. You know? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, if we don't have any other questions for John, and John, you don't have any other observations that you want to make, then I think we just thank you so much. And we'll see you hopefully tomorrow morning to hear the presentation of the cantata, and tomorrow evening for our showcase finale extravaganza.